Hi everyone, welcome. The two bins that you see right here, one above the other, they're the ones that we're going to be checking in on today. These systems, as you can see from the label, have African nightcrawlers living in them. Both started on the same day, so they're the same age. They're both 10 days off from hitting their 1 year in service date. And it was 10 days ago that we initiated the migration of the worms out of the material. We used all kinds of delicious stuff, pumpkin and watermelon and strawberry, and it was laid out onto just the far edge of the bins over here. I even put a little stick on top of the plastic that was meant to keep the plastic from accidentally drifting away. I wanted that feeding zone to stay nice and damp, and I'm very curious to see how 10 days of progress are coming along. We'll take a look in there, possibly add a little bit more food, possibly stir up and aerate the finished castings. I'm sure hoping that the migration's coming along good. So let's put on a glove and get to work. So now, according to my notes, there was one aeration done since our video last time we checked in here 10 days ago. There wouldn't have been any sort of record of that. I would have just come in here and, aerated the stuff that's down here in the feeding zone, and then put everything back to let it continue. So that was sort of an off-record, I believe, check-in. I'm curious to see if I should have been more diligent in aerating the material on a more regular basis. It did seem to me like the stuff was holding up, pretty good in terms of hanging on to its moisture. I had really hoped that I'd be able to, till up the material and aerate it and try to promote its drying to the point where the worms would want to exit the stuff voluntarily and make their way over into the feeding area on their own. You saw right there on the edge where we were closest to the feeding zone, a pretty good number of worms hanging out. Times like this, I always like to think that they're on their way and they just haven't gotten there yet. But maybe that's not the best way to gauge how the depopulation of the castings is coming along. Perhaps checking a little bit further out is a good idea. See, we only went about halfway out, not even to the far edge, furthest away from the feeding zone, and we're already seeing far fewer worms hanging out in this stuff. And I could tell, just from the way it feels, and maybe if you can even see from the color, it does appear lighter to me. Like if it's drier. It definitely is drier. I would almost guarantee it. So we've got a very similar kind of situation over here. I don't have to go down very deep before I start hitting some material that's fairly damp, and due to that is fairly populated with worms. Here again, I'd like to think that they're just a stone's throw away from their destination. They're just kind of making their way over there gradually, and I interrupted them. We'll definitely let them continue with their journey towards the feeding zone. But it does seem to me like maybe there's more damp stuff that's right up against the feeding zone. Maybe we can give it a good jolt of dryness. How does that sound? Because we haven't disturbed the most dry stuff over on the far end, including the stuff on the very top surface. So perhaps this is our chance to kind of sour the milk over here a little bit and make the material a lot drier than it was when we first excavated it and found all those worms in it. And perhaps the worms will react to the material that they're in. Once they sense it's much drier than it had been, maybe they'll go looking for something a little bit better. So now, I guess along that same thinking, we might as well see what the rest of this stuff over here looks like. This is the most dry stuff, I would have to say. The most distant from where the feeding zone was. Although I'm sure that just the little edge right closest to the feeding zone was the only section that really benefited from any of those juicy watermelon bits and pumpkin bits all thawing out and dumping out their moisture. I'm sure only a little bit of the castings material got wet from that. My hope was that it was the material over in the feeding zone that caught most of that moisture. So you know what? I'm liking the way things are coming along here. I think the best bet we can do is try to keep these worms, every time I hit a little jumble of them, keep them over near where we want them, close to the destination that we're driving them towards. But every time we find a nice pocket of material that's still quite damp, I'll try to break it apart a little bit and introduce some drier stuff into it, blend it in, and we'll gradually keep sort of homogenizing the consistency of the material over on this side, helping it all become a little bit drier, especially in the sections that are quite damp still, further motivating our worms to do what we want them to do. So you know what, we'll do the same thing over here. Take all this nice dry stuff that's sitting out here on the top surface and poor wormies in this nice damp stuff are not going to appreciate that, but that's okay. We're going to give them a way out. We're going to give them a salvation, a place to go, a place to flee and get back into nice damp moisture and comfort. And that's going to be our feeding zone. I'm definitely curious to see what kind of progress the feeding zone is making in terms of gathering worms, but I really did want to start out just by gauging how the depopulation was progressing. And I'm definitely liking what I see. I think we're on a good trajectory here in terms of these worm castings being for the most part depopulated, possibly in the next 10 days. I don't think it's fair to think that they're going to do it completely. I don't think they're just going to move out of all this stuff entirely, because there are little sections of it that are still in really good shape in terms of quite damp still and quite cozy. Yes, even over here I'm pulling out little wads of worms. Sometimes when I find little wads of worms in the material that's out here and already somewhat dry, I start to wonder if those are just little wads of worms that are sort of huddling together to try to protect themselves from the encroaching dryness. Or maybe they were just huddled around a little ball of something like this. You know, sometimes a little damp cluster of material is what the worms are just huddling around because there's a good little pocket of moisture sitting there for them, and they're just taking advantage of it. Every time I hit something like that, I'm just sort of breaking it up and blending it in, and I think as a result all this material is going to become a whole lot drier. Alright, let's consider this material as aerated and kind of homogenized with the dry stuff getting introduced down where the moisture was. Now I'm going to do what I did before, is sort of try to just pull stuff away from this little partition so we can kind of consider what we're seeing here without feeling like we've got to be overly cautious and littering the beautiful finished castings with all kinds of debris and chunks of paper and cardboard. To a certain point it's already just happening anyway, but I like to try to avoid that, see if I can keep the material nice and free of any debris. So just pushing things aside here a little bit, what I envisioned here was possibly adding a little bit more bedding, nice damp bedding, in case what they had already was starting to seem like it might be running low. Although if you look what's happening over there, at least it looks pretty good still. Now what do we have here? Some sort of chunk of paper, definitely part of the feeding zone. Here again, I don't want to blend in all kinds of debris and paper chunks and whatever into the stuff that, you know, I might be throwing in my garden pretty soon. All these beautiful castings. I like to try to keep this stuff separate from what's happening in the migration zone when I'm doing this sort of inspection. So here too, I'm just gonna slide over this little partition divider, and then we'll use the plastic to protect our nice castings even further. Those little migration partitions are, I don't know, they're holding up pretty good. I made them pretty large, so look at all those worms, wow. So it does seem like if we had to, we can just put it right back into service and it would still have, you know, a good amount of the material just ready to go as a partition going forward, because it's still intact and full of holes and readily usable that way. It does look to me like a good number of worms have made their way over into the into the feeding zone. Definitely curious to see what we've got going on over here. No surprise. Very similar story. That's awesome. Just what I wanted to see. Yeah, the stem of a pumpkin. I wonder if the other system's got one floating around over there too. Probably does. So you can see it is a little bit difficult to see the worms when they're all kind of blended in with the shredded paper and cardboard. And that was kind of the reason I thought I might avoid using the shredded paper and cardboard in the feeding zones, just so that it'll be easier to spot the worms when we explore the feeding zones. You know what, let me get some bedding. I got the food right here, and we'll rebuild here a little bit, beef up the size of these feeding zones, and then we'll let these little guys get back to work. I'm going to get these plastic sheets out of our way briefly, just so we can better see what we're doing here. I'll bring them back at some point. And I was finding little worms on my glove, so one of them I tried flicking off my finger, picking it up off my glove, flicking it, then I lost track of where the little guy landed, and I overshot the bin to rescue the little guy. So I imagined this kind of going back where it was. Luckily, not too much of its bottom has deteriorated. That means we've got a little bit of extra space in here for more bedding to build out our feeding zone a little bit more. At this point, it does seem like we need space to house a pretty good size population of worms. And we do have a few more left in the finished castings that need to come over. But it does seem to me like the majority of them have already successfully migrated out of their castings. Or am I just seeing what I want to see? No, I think that is the case. I think we've got a pretty good moving migration going on here. What I'll usually do when I'm setting up one of these feeding zones, I'll usually, push all the worked stuff towards the finished castings end of the bin, and then I'll try to reset furthest away from where the worms are. This way, if they come on over from the finished castings, they're going to find themselves in a nice busy spot where there's other worms and a lot of good activity, a lot of broken in material that they could just dig right into. And all that stuff a little bit further in, that's almost like backup, I assume, at this point. Stuff to kind of keep the process running, but maybe isn't going to be quite usable by the worms immediately in the first couple days. So we're just stacking in some paper towels and some napkins, and it does seem like I had a little bit more here than I thought I did. I guess when everything's all folded up, it's a little bit tough to see what you're dealing with. So this stuff's all dry. So I'm going to bring up my squirt bottle. There's not a lot of water left in this thing, but I'm assuming I left it with some pressure and that there's enough to get the job done. My main interest was just to introduce a good bit of moisture down onto this dry paper, perhaps even down into the material that makes up the feeding zone. Last time we threw in pumpkin and strawberry and watermelon bits, all stuff that was going to just pour out moisture as it started breaking down and as it thawed out because it was all frozen. This time the stuff we're giving them is in large part dry. So far everything we've put in was dry. So is our worm chow, and so is, for the most part, the coffee I'm giving them too. I mean, the coffee, one of them has been sitting around drying for a day or two. That one is not very dry at all. The other one just came out of the machine a short while ago. That one's got a little bit more moisture in it, but not much more. And let's see. Something I usually do is I plop in a little bit of my worm chow with the coffee, just to not let the coffee be such a boring meal. So that's a pretty nice combination over there. Coffee and worm chow. sprinkled in on top of some nice fresh bedding for them. And you know, I got my supply of prepared bedding here too. Why don't we just dump in a little bit of that as well for good measure. I think that's plenty. I mean, we don't have to go crazy. It was left over already, so the bedding that was remaining from the previous go around was still here in pretty good amounts. And now what we've given them is going to be a nice supplement. And you know what, just to give them a nice little treat, a little bit more worm chow. I'm going to finish off in here with just a little bit more moisture. Once again, trying to give them exactly what they want. You know, as their castings over on the other end dry out and the worms are looking for material that they would feel more comfortable in, I assume that a nice damp bedding is what they're on the lookout for. And if they make their way over into the feeding area, that's exactly what they're going to get, and they're going to love it. So I'm just going to build it back up, and I think there's still plenty of room here. But I just wanted to kind of maximize, if possible, to a certain degree, the size of the area of the material that's sitting out here to continue to dry to the air, open to the air, uncovered. So if it was all just stacked up as high as possible over here, it would have not as good of a chance to dry off, I believe. This way, by exposing more of its surface area to the air, I believe it will help with the drying. And we'll give the same treatment to bin number 2 over here. Yeah, things look pretty good. So these little sticks were holding the plastic in place to keep things from moving around. There's not a whole lot left here to do. Maybe we can just reposition our coffee filters to sort of become our feeding zone indicators. A little bit of a tradition down here now that we would have much of a hard time finding where the feeding zone in these systems are. It's pretty obvious. And then back and come the plastic. You know, I'll save that for later. That's all boring stuff. I got some cleaning up to do. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.